Welcome back to the latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training, Tokyo, Japan. And my special guest today is an old friend of mine, Georg Loeer, from NRW.Global Business Japan. Georg, welcome.
Greg,
thank you.
Nice to see you today.
Thank you. Now, Georg, you've been in Japan, how many years altogether now?
Well, counting probably around 35.
35, right? So we're very similar in length. Yeah, I'm about the same, 36. So how is it that you got to Japan in the first place? Why are you here and why have you been running all these companies here? Or organizations, I should say.
Well, it was not really my own doing because my parents delivered me, so to say, in 1955 here in Tokyo. And I was then happy to be able to stay here the first 5 years of my life. And
what was your father doing in Japan at that time?
My father was in Japan in pre-war Japan.
Oh. Okay.
But then in 1953 he came back as a diplomat, working for the German embassy,
right.
And was here until 1960 when we left Japan.
Yeah. He had his next posting, I guess. So when did you get back to Japan?
Well, I actually came back to Japan in 1974,
right.
But at that time not to Tokyo, but to Osaka and Kobe. Again, this was due to my parents because my father became the consul general for Germany in Osaka, Kobe, and I was just out of school, and of course I had this Japanese background, but it was really all very new to me.
Right, so I was also consul general in Osaka, and living in Kobe, so presumably he was doing the same thing. So what happens then? You come back, you must be about 1920 by that stage, I guess, yeah?
Well, of course, initially I had no idea about Japan other than, having at home all kinds of things related to Japan. But I discovered Japan from Western Japan. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Western Japan is very deep culture, very interesting, Kyoto, Nara, and of course also at the time, business-wise, still a very strong area of Japanese business. So I was very fortunate to meet a lot of people, also from the business community, through my parents, who were well connected at the time. And that caught my interest. And I remember buying a book for Japanese language learning at the Umeda Kinokuniya store, and then slowly trying to pick up some Japanese. But I had to do my military service, so I returned to Germany, and then I went to university in southern Germany in Tübingen, and but somehow Japan did not disappear or did not leave me alone. So I studied a mix of things, political science, history, and then Japanese studies. And that brought me back in 1978, 79 to first Sophia University, actually, and then to ICU, where I did intensive Japanese training. So 1 year in Japan, very intensive training. Of course, where does it get you to? You still have to a lifelong learning period for Japanese.
So were you, when you say you were at Georgie at Sophia, were you at the Ichigo campus doing Japanese there?
Exactly.
We were there at the same time, George.
Really?
Yes, I was there. I got to Japan on April 1st, 1979, and I spent the next couple of years at the Ichigo campus, and then I did my master's degree for another 2 years. So we probably saw you there.
Very close.
Stage.
Well, to be honest, I was there for one trimester
Okay.
because my Japanese teacher, and this was 1978 in summer or fall, she was from ICU, and she told me, well, if you only have 1 year, 6 hours or 8 hours of Japanese is not enough. You have to do the intensive course at ICU. That's why I became a guest student at ICU and only took the night courses at Ichigaya campus, which
Right.
was very interesting.
Yeah.
And, the basic information about politics in Japan, or there was a very interesting course on German-Japanese history during the war, or and many other courses that I got initially from Jochi, from Sophia University, and then I moved out to ICU, which was also a very nice experience. I'm actually quite proud that my son, Tomo, is now also at Sophia University, because now we're 3 generations at Sophia University.
Oh, is that right?
Because my father, before the war, also studied at Sophia University.
Oh, wow. What a strong connection.
Yes.
Wow, amazing. I didn't realize that we actually had Georgie the same time. That's really another layer of familiarity, right?
Well, I think later in our careers also we had similar crossovers.
That's true.
But I returned back to Germany and continued my studies in Berlin. And I was very fortunate to have 2 very good teachers from the University of Tokyo in Berlin. And this was a very small group of students, and we studied about the Japanese economy and things like that. And this again took me to University of Tokyo in 1984, 85. So I spent quite a long time at university. And
how many years altogether?
Don't ask. It's unfair. And
well, I was there for 14 years. Was it more than that?
Well, I could have tried and challenged that. But I was actually, when I was here for the second time, I joined a program called Sprache und Praxis, which was set up by DAAD, the German scholarship organization. And they had 12 or 14 students who had already completed their studies and were in Japan to study Japanese and about Japanese business. So that got me started more in a more practical way with regard to Japanese business. We visited companies like Toyota, Dentsu, Nissan, Fujitsu, and also Deutsche Bank, or other companies. And I was already quite good at Japanese, so sometimes I acted as the translator for these fellow students.
Nice.
But that kind of got me interested in working for a company. I had always envisioned 3 scenarios for myself. 1, become a diplomat like my father. 2, become a university professor. And 3, go into business. So at that point in time, I'd spent enough time at university and felt this is not going to be it. And the foreign service is always, you have to move from place to place. And I had experienced that for myself and felt, let's stick to one place if possible. And that's why I then, after returning to Germany, initially applied for a lot of jobs with relation to Japan. And one bank was willing to take me. And this was a small merchant bank operation in Frankfurt called BHF Bank, which had a very long tradition in Germany, actually one of the first German banks established in the 19th century, in 1853, if I remember correctly. And they were like a merchant and investment bank. And they had a very profitable operation in Tokyo, mainly focusing on foreign exchange, on very niche financing activity, and trade finance. And so we were a 50-person unit in Marunouchi at the time, and I initially started working at their Frankfurt head office, but because I was, the Japan guy in Frankfurt, I was able to meet a lot of people, higher level people, together with our managing partners in Frankfurt, and this gave me a very good opportunity to develop my banking skills, but also to develop the contacts to Japan. I did a training at Sanwa Bank. At one point, they sent me for some time to Sanwa Bank to do some training on the ground here. But then in 1992, I was transferred to Tokyo to work in this branch in Marunouchi. And I remember how small the desk was, and to work on a small shima, as they call it, the island, together with 4 or 5 people in this marketing team in this branch was really a great experience.
So I arrived in 92 to start the Austrade office in
Nagoya.
And you arrive in Marunouchi in 92. So our careers are again intertwining. So, George, how long were you in that office in Marunouchi with that organization?
Well, I worked there for 5 years until 97. I started out as assistant manager, then moved up to become manager, and actually for the last, I think, 1.5 years, I was general manager of the branch.
Okay. So what were your leadership experiences? Like you'd been working as one of the team in Frankfurt, and you're learning about banking, and you're getting exposure to high-level people, which is great. So you come, you're sort of like the latest arrival in Marunouchi branch, right? So you're down the bottom somewhere, and gradually you work your way up. So what were your first experiences of managing a team? And I suppose the team was composed of mainly Japanese, or a mixture of Germans and Japanese, or all Germans?
Only Japanese.
Only Japanese,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Of course, my bosses, we had always a German general manager initially. They were experienced bankers. They had worked in Germany, but also outside of Germany, in Japan. And we had a Japanese, he was not originally general manager, but he was head of our trading unit, who was a very well-respected person in the scene, FX trading. And you can imagine traders are always a little bit of a special character. So we had this kind of competitive situation in the branch. We had this very energetic and team of dealers who were, had quite a few swings of profits and losses, but overall quite profitable. And on the other hand, we had this little bit more staid banking team, which followed, of course, the head office instructions as regards credit quality and so forth. But so we kind of had a ride on the ridge, not to fall off the ridge, we needed to have sufficient margins, but we also had to, keep the risk book clean. And so this was a very good experience. And I had German customers like Volkswagen, BMW,
nice.
Merck, and others,
nice.
which I also developed at the time.
Nice.
So this was a very nice experience for me, and also got recognition for me from the team. And but the other thing was we started using derivatives, and you can't really say it these days, but we actually started our derivatives operation out of our corporate banking unit. I mean, when I say derivatives, we're not talking about equity derivatives or other high spec derivatives. What we were doing was mainly hedging our loans. We were taking long-term funds from Japanese life insurance companies and hedging that with interest rate derivatives with the JP Morgans of this world. And but that was a phase where I felt you could really bring change in the organization. You could actually contribute to the bank as a whole, because BHF Bank as a bank was traditionally more short-term funded, and we had big shareholders like Allianz, but it was always majority short-term funded. And we always were interested in getting in long-term funding to improve that situation, to improve the ratios.
Improve the quality.
Yes. And so that, in that sense, we did provide a lot of long-term funding for the bank, and that was also positively recognized.
But what about in terms of day-to-day leadership? Like, you're the assistant manager, now you're the manager, then you become the general manager. So you've got to be responsible for people in your teams. What was that like there? Like your first experience of that, what was challenging about that, or what was different about that you noticed?
Well, in the beginning, of course, I was very much in a learning mode, because I had experienced Japanese colleagues, bankers around me, some of them much better at the math than I was. But I think what was very important and an important experience was that we really had a team spirit there. We worked closely together, and of course, one of the important functions for expat employee in Japan was always to communicate with the head office, and also to kind of explain why the Japanese are as Japanese as they are. And because we had certain people on board who were actually bringing very good business, but were not that good at explaining themselves. And the board member from Germany came and said, "This guy is so quiet, he's not saying anything,
Why do we need him?
Why do we need him?" Yeah. And
he's not contributing anything.
Where in fact he was a very consistent and diligent worker. Okay, but over the years, of course, the requirements changed, and the style of working, managing relationships in Japan changed. And
what was the change? What changed?
Well, I think first of all, the regulatory environment changed. I remember the BOJ or MOF inspections in the early years, and then experienced them in other contexts in later years. It was totally different cookies. Yeah, so that was the one thing. But things also became much more technical, and you needed much more complicated infrastructure to manage the risks and so on. So from that point of view, you had to sometimes make decisions which were maybe not easy to take, but you had to follow certain guidelines offered by or prescribed by head office. But I think in working with the Japanese team, it's important to understand that people need challenges. And if you can show that there are opportunities and that there are rewards to be gained from challenging something, even if you kind of step into a slightly gray area at one point, you can really change things. And move forward. I think that's very important.
That's interesting because, generally speaking, banking is a very conservative business with a high, risk sensitivity, and then you add on top of that layer Japanese risk aversion as well. So pretty amazing that you're able to get change with both of those factors in place. So how did you manage to do that?
Well, as I said, if you look at Japanese culture and let's say German or culture, in Germany everything is very clearly regulated. The law or the directions exactly spell out what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. In Japan, that's different. There is administrative guidance. There are things you're not allowed to do, but there are some areas where you have to test the waters to actually see whether this in the end is applicable or not. And especially in the 80s or 90s, many banks pushed that line a bit further. I mean, names like Bankers Trust or probably also JP Morgan or Merrill Lynch and others probably experienced such situations. And I was always curious. So curiosity is a very important point. I was always curious about new products and new business opportunities, and went to all kinds of events and didn't take much formal training, but interacting with customers, trying to learn what opportunities are out there, and to motivate our colleagues to also share this curiosity and to share this brave spirit, so to say, to engage with such situations. I think that's an important part of what you can contribute here.
So how did you engage them? I mean, you're asking them to step out of their comfort zone. The dynamic market conditions are very obvious to them. But still, to take steps or take action or whatever, that's a little bit different. So for them to step out of their comfort zone, to challenge, from a Japanese perspective, is not a straightforward thing. That's quite a big deal. So how are you engaging them to be able to encourage them to do that?
Well, as you know, in Japan, Japanese like to have meetings. I'm not such a great fan of meetings, not in the density or intensity Japanese sometimes like to have it, but nonetheless communicating with the team on a daily or at least once a week basis is very important to get the feedback. Where do we stand? Where do we want to go? What are our goals? Who are our target customers? What do we want to sell them? How do we sell it to them? So these things are very important. In that sense, and that is something I also feel very strongly about today, it's very important to train and to learn how to market yourself and how to, engage your customer. That's
So when you say market yourself, you're talking about personal brand, your own personal professional brand now in terms of how people perceive you and how you are communicating with people. Is that what you mean?
Well, that's one point, but the other point is really to get the message over, to get the key messages over. What do we really want to transport to the customer, and how do we get that message over? And I find that many Japanese companies in the activity I'm dealing with right now have interesting products and services, but they lack this capability to actually positively market themselves, to get their key messages over, which resound with their customers. And this is something Japan really needs to work a lot on. And I think this is where Dale Carnegie or other organizations like that can really create additional value and contribute in a great way.
Thank you. And so you're in the organization, general manager, 5 years. What happens then, George?
Well, in my career, I've had good terms and times also which were very bitter. So at the end of the 5 years, actually, we had to close the branch because our main shareholder, Allianz, was planning to divest from BHF Bank, and there were ideas of bringing the bank into a different constellation. So if you remember, in the early 90s, there were a lot of foreign banks in Japan, and more and more banks were engaged in derivatives activities, as I had mentioned earlier. And in Frankfurt, we also had a big derivatives desk. And here we were still running a very classical FX business, which had high risk, but was maybe not at the edge of what was going to develop in the following years. That was one point. The other point was that we had Allianz as a shareholder, which in the medium term wanted to divest its shareholding in BHF Bank, which meant that the bank had to put itself on a different footing and cut back its foreign branch network. So the branch decided to close Tokyo branch and also a Singapore branch later. And that's a bitter experience, of course, because you have to talk to your employees and explain that the bank has taken a certain decision, and that you will, of course, support them in finding new opportunities. But it's an inevitable result. You have to then sell
Which for
to
most Japanese employees, that would have been shocking, because a bank is thought to be very solid, firm, good foundation, long career, dedicated my life to the bank, and now the bank's dumping me, so it would have been hard to take.
And I'm not quite sure, but probably BHF Bank was one of the first banks to exit from the Tokyo market in 1997, 98. Okay, you could say, people in management had a certain vision or view of the Tokyo market and had their own strategic decisions to take. I personally wouldn't have taken that decision. I would have tried to kind of redevelop the branch in a different direction. But you have to accept what the board management tells you. We did a good job in that, I think, for the employees as well as for the bank, selling assets, placing the employees in new, helping them find new engagements. And Deutsche Bank actually then spoke to me and asked me whether I would be interested to join them, not in Tokyo, but in Asia. And I felt that would be a great opportunity. I knew Jürgen Fitschen, who at one point had been general manager of the Tokyo branch and headed the Southeast Asia operation or the Asia operation of Deutsche Bank at the time from Singapore. And so I met Jürgen Fitschen in Singapore, and then after some time he and his colleagues invited me to join Deutsche Bank in Jakarta, which was one of the biggest branches in the Asia-Pacific network. and I became head of corporate banking. But at the time, you're talking 1997, the sun was shining when I was arriving in Jakarta, but after the Thai baht weakened substantially, and the Malaysian ringgit, also the Indonesian rupiah dropped substantially. So I turned from a corporate banker dining and wining his clients to a workout banker who had to get his money back. And we had quite a substantial portfolio in Indonesia at the time, which was, again, a very new and challenging experience for me.
That's a tough... I've done that too during Lehman, working out with clients, and you feel bad about that because they're loyal clients, and you've built up a good collection of clients, and now you're just burning them. That's painful.
Well, in Indonesia, you have the large conglomerates, the Pribumi conglomerates, which are often state-related. And then you have the Chinese conglomerates, big companies run by overseas Chinese mainly. And you have many medium-sized companies. Actually, initially I was very surprised that Deutsche Bank was dealing with such medium-sized companies, because in Japan, nobody would touch these medium-sized companies. We were all just jockeying around, trying to deal with the big companies. And but there were really a lot of excellent medium-sized companies in Indonesia, and it was a great pity that the top management of Deutsche Bank then, as a result of this Asian crisis, decided to exit this mid-sized company field. Okay, a workout situation is a special situation. You create a good bank and a bad bank, and you focus on getting your money back in the bad bank, and you develop your business with non-risk products with the blue chip companies. I think the job was done quite well at the time in Asia, and of course we had lots of experienced colleagues who came in who had worked in Argentina or other locations on very similar situations, and I learned a lot. But after 2 years I felt hungry for Japan again, and fortunately I was able to move to Bayerische Landesbank, who hired me to become their future general manager in Tokyo. And I spent some time in Munich to get accustomed to the special Landesbank and Bavarian atmosphere. And
was it different? I don't know much about Germany. Is that quite a culturally different experience?
Yes, it's a different experience. I must say, in hindsight, I was really very lucky because I originally come from the area called North Rhine-Westphalia, which is in the western northern part of Germany. But I studied in Berlin, I worked in Frankfurt, I spent my military time in Niedersachsen, Lower Saxony, and I then also worked in Munich. So I've seen quite a bit of Germany, which is a big advantage to others who have maybe only spent some time in one location. And Bavaria is a very dynamic region, no doubt. They do not have the legacy assets of coal and steel industry. They have a bit of that, but very minuscule. And they have a lot of high-tech companies, also startups and others. So we at Bausch Landesbank also had excellent customers at the time here. A very different business model, because as a AAA bank, you had absolutely no problem taking in long-term funding. On the other hand, trading and derivatives or trade finance, rather minuscule. So this was a totally different business model, but I enjoyed working for the bank, 3 years in Tokyo,
So
general manager.
when you came in, how long before you became the general manager there?
Immediately.
Oh, immediately. So
Yes.
you're coming in as the boss.
Yeah.
So what's that like? You've got a whole bunch of people. How many people are in that branch at that time, or in the bank at that time in Japan?
Must have been around 50 also.
50, right?
Yeah,
So they've been working under other leaders, and then suddenly the new
Actually-
guy turns up.
Actually, it was at the time very gracious, luxurious situation. We had 3 general managers.
Whoa, okay.
So there was one German colleague who I was going to replace. So we worked together for a certain time. And there was a Japanese colleague, very experienced Japanese banker, who was running the corporate desk. And I was to take over as the so-called principal officer, looking after the bank.
The whole thing.
The whole thing, yes.
So how did you go about establishing yourself as the leader there? Because you've had very good experiences already in Japan. You've also been in Jakarta and the meltdown down there, right? So you've seen another world there. But what was your approach to, okay, you're working with the existing general manager, you're going to succeed him. What was your approach to establish yourself as a leader within the bank?
Well, I would say it's a mixed approach, because on the one hand, you have to adapt to the existing team and the existing colleagues. On the other hand, you have to bring in new ideas and new business opportunities, because you can't just continue with what has been done up to now. And to be quite frank, of course, that can from time to time cause friction. So
when you said that, I was thinking probably none of the Japanese would have put their hand up volunteering for something new and different. They would have been very happy with what they had been doing for a long time, which they're excellent at.
Well, I wouldn't say none of them, but I mean, this is again a question of corporate culture and how you interact with people. It was interesting. We actually brought in, together with myself, we brought in from Munich a young person who was on the treasury and derivatives team in Munich at the time. And he was young but very knowledgeable, and he did a lot to bring the treasury team up to speed. And on the other hand, we, of course, had these relations with German and international customers. And it's a good experience for me. It has been a good experience for me. I had, and this has always been very important for me, I had very good board members to work with. At BHF Bank, this was extremely important. Had a very knowledgeable board member, not only as a banker, but also people who tried to understand Japan, who had been to Japan many times, and who had a very positive attitude about Japan. And that was not always the case with Bausch Landesbank, but I had also then a board member with whom I related very well, and he actually wanted me to come to Munich or to Singapore, and well, in the end, after 3 years, I moved to Hong Kong to become the chief executive of the Hong Kong branch.
Okay, hang on. So I'm losing the time log here.
Yes.
When did that happen? Is this
That
you've
was
gone Jakarta
2000,
back to
yeah.
Tokyo?
I was in Tokyo from 2003 to 2000 from, sorry. I was in Tokyo from 2000 to 2003, and then in Hong Kong and Shanghai 2004, 2005. I say Shanghai, actually I was the chief executive of the Hong Kong branch, but I was also the regional head for the corporate business for Asia. And our main focus at the time was to expand our operations in mainland China, in Shanghai. And we had a German center in Shanghai, which was being built. We had a relatively small branch in Shanghai. And what we did was apply for a Chinese currency yuan banking license, which we got after a period of 6 months or so, to be able to do more business in China. And otherwise I was kind of flying around the region and cooperating.
So it's Tokyo, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and then from there do you come back to Tokyo and then you go to Jakarta, or I'm just a bit lost on the timeline.
Oh, sorry. Well, maybe to just give you an overview over the my time in banking.
Yeah. Okay.
I worked from 87 to 92 in Frankfurt, BHF Bank, then for 5 years here in Tokyo, also for BHF Bank, and then moved to Jakarta 1997 to 1999, and then moved to Munich and spent half a year in Munich, and then from beginning of 2000 until end of 2003 I was in Tokyo.
Back here.
Moving then to Hong Kong.
Right.
And from Hong Kong I was moving around the region, in the end mainly focusing on the Shanghai branch activity. And then I was offered a new position to open a branch for a bank called Eurohypo in Tokyo. Eurohypo was actually the leading real estate and public finance bank in Germany. And it had been consolidated from real estate finance activities of Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and Commerzbank. They were still the three main shareholders, and located just outside Frankfurt, and had a very good team of real estate finance experts, and they were very keen to develop the Japanese market at the time. So they were looking for a branch manager to open the branch and run the branch opportunities. Actually, just across the road, we had our office here initially. And so I worked for them and helped set up their Tokyo office.
So that means let's talk about that a little bit, because the theme of this podcast is about leadership. So I'm thinking that you've got to recruit people, you've got to organise a space, you've got to start dealing with the FSA, Financial Service Agency, and there's an enormous amount of things. When you say we opened a branch in Tokyo, that's a huge thing. So how did you go about recruiting people? What was that like setting it up? Because you're the founder now. That's quite something special.
Well, I was very fortunate to have relations with people who had been working in banking here for a number of years. So I approached some of these people, Japanese or foreigners, to work together. We had also, of course, from Germany, people who were delegated to Tokyo. And initially we started out as every kind of startup in a serviced office here in Tokyo, and working together with lawyers to get everything prepared. And of course, we had the IT system set up, support from Germany, which was also very well organized. And we then moved into a location called Otago Hills and set up office there at on one of the upper floors.
Which again by itself is a bit, it's not downtown, it's close, but it's not Marunouchi, it's
exactly.
not Akasaka, it's, that was a little bit of a different choice. What made you choose Otago Hills?
Well, of course, I had worked previously in Marunouchi for 2 banks, but as you know, the rents in Marunouchi are quite substantial. And we had always been, of course, very cost conscious and looked for opportunities in the market to find appropriate and cheaper locations. And as you may remember, there was a time when banks moved out of Marunouchi to Kamiyacho, or even here to the Ark Hills area. And Otago Hills at the time was a relatively new development by Mori building and had a good infrastructure. And for such a relatively small branch, it was an excellent location. We actually later then brought the Commerzbank operations also over to Otago Hills because Commerzbank then decided to take over Eurohypo as a whole.
Oh, okay.
So I actually at the time met with the CEO of Commerzbank also, and they wanted to preempt another predator who wanted to take over the bank, the number 2 in Germany, wanted to take us over, and so Commerzbank then decided to take over Eurohypo at the time. Well, for me that meant I had to think about new avenues because since Commerzbank already had a banking license here, the Ministry of Finance was not willing to give us an additional banking license. So what we did was we established a finance company. And this, of course, only required a much smaller compliance and regulatory apparatus than a bank. And so this having been set up, that's the point where I then, the founding document still bears my name, but then after that I agreed with the bank to then depart. And I'm actually in hindsight quite happy that I found a good point in time to leave banking then. Obviously, it's not easy for a person who has experience as on a general manager level for a foreign bank in Japan, then to step into a similar role here. But I said to myself, well, I've worked for a number of German banks, and at the time I didn't want to work for a foreign bank. So I decided to set up my own company. And that was a very good decision at the time. And through this company, I then came into contact with my current employer.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. So how long did you have your own company?
Well, I established my own company in December 2006.
Right.
And it actually still exists because my wife now runs the company. But at the time, we were focusing on three areas. One was had to do with consulting for a German related company here in Tokyo, which was establishing a new business activity here. So I went into that company as a consultant to work with them. And the other had to do with real estate, because I had this real estate background to a certain extent, and a very good friend of mine who worked with big companies and banks like Fortress or Credit Suisse, UBS, in recycling properties from the bubble era, wanted to do some business with me, with Japanese investors. And the third was I had a relatively good network of contacts and did a little bit of HR consulting on the side. So those three areas were what I started out with. And this real estate activity actually brought me to Germany. And there, by chance, I met people from NRW Bank at the time, one of the former general managers of a bank called WestLB, which split up into the old WestLB and the new NRW Bank, was the board member on the bank board. And he said, well, there's this organization here which is involved in investment and trade between North Rhine-Westphalia and Japan. Is that not something which might be interesting for you? And by coincidence, the position I occupy right now had just been vacated. And I said, well, that's an interesting opportunity.
Which is what I was doing too, trade and investment for Australia. You're doing it for Germany. So we interlock again.
Yes, in the same location, actually.
Yes, that's right.
In the New Otani
Garden
Court, yes. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at what bankers do, at least in the traditional sense, and if you look at what I'm doing today, there are very many similarities, because you work with people from all kinds of industries, but not only from industry. You work with university and research institutions, you work with startups, you work with government, you work with media. So that was a very good base to develop. And in the new role at NRW Invest at the time, we already had a very strong base of Japanese companies in Germany, nearly 600 companies, Japanese companies. Yeah. And so that was a very established and very seasoned organization at the time.
So, George, thinking across your career in Japan, you know, you've worked in many different teams, you've been the leader in different companies, different businesses. And so if you reflect about how to get engagement from the team, what things have you found that have worked very well for getting people engaged?
Well, I must say I've been always a very democratic leader. You know, in Japan, as you know, there are different types of leaders. There are the top-down leaders, there are the bottom-up leaders, and I see myself somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Because I think it's very important if you want to raise the talent, or if you want to engage people, you have to listen to them, and you have to convince them to work with you, especially if you're in a small team. You know, you need everyone who's on board, from your colleagues to the intern. It's a team you have to work together with, and you have to convey a mission or a sense of reason why you're doing this and why we need to do it in a certain way. And we have been, I can proudly say that at NRW.Global Business, as the organization is called today, we have actually been a pacemaker for our organization. We started very early on focusing on industry research. I was very lucky to have a graduate of the Swiss Technical University, ETH Zurich, with us for 2 years. He had worked as a consultant before, and he helped us set up this industry research capabilities, and helped us to think as consultants. And so with this tool set, we again and again looked at certain industries, we looked at companies, we tried to develop business proposals for companies. So this kind of mindset, entrepreneurial mindset, is something which is not natural for a government-owned institution. And we were, I would say, first in the organization to take this focus topic industry analysis type of approach. Why do we do that? Because we need to understand how our counterparts think. What kind of industry are they in? What are the issues which make them tick? Each manager or each CEO, of course, has different priorities, but first of all, you have to understand the industry they're in. Second of all, you have to discover the companies which are in this industry. And you have to analyze, are they only active in Japan? Do they grow rapidly? Do they already do business in the US or Asia? Are they already in Europe? And to find the interesting companies which are capable and willing and interested to go to Europe.
So these ideas, is this a case of you get the insight based on your commercial experience and you see, okay, we could actually go this way? Or is it a case of your team members get the insight and say, you know, boss, I think we could probably do this? Is it coming from top down and the idea cascade, or is it a bottom up fountain? What have we got here? A cascade or a fountain?
I think it's both.
Both, okay. Right.
Yes, because as a team leader, you have to lead your team and you have to communicate what kind of targets and mission you have. And the mission, you, of course, to a certain extent, you can influence that mission yourself, but a mission is given by the company. But you have to communicate that to your team members, and at the same time, you should always be open to the ideas that come out of team members. And I've always enjoyed working with young people and young interns sometimes, because they are incredibly creative and they are very good at bringing in new ideas. And of course, you have to sometimes say, okay, this is no good and this is good. But making use of such incredibly creative resources has helped me a lot over my career. With working only very few people now, that has been very good. But already in my time in banking, I was always very eager to take in interns and work with interns. Some of them have gone on to become chief risk officers at insurance companies or startup entrepreneurs and working with large corporation nowadays. So it's a little bit of a family we still nurture and keep.
And what about with your Japanese team members? You know, getting ideas from them, or getting them to suggest alternatives, or initiatives. What has your experience been with the best way to make that happen?
You know our Japanese friends better than I do, and
don't know about that, George.
but I think the Japanese have huge potential in many ways. They are usually well educated. They are open. They are honest mostly, and they are hardworking. The issue is how to get them off their normal track, so to say, without derailing them.
Yeah.
And I think you sometimes have to just test the water, or you sometimes have to bring in a number of ideas and discuss them with the team and say, well, why don't we do this? Yeah? And there will be response. Yeah? And if there's no response, you have to ask 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. It is insistence on getting the feedback, which is extremely important.
Why is there that, I'll use the word reluctance, that may not be the best word, but why is there that hesitation, say, for them to give you the feedback? Like you said, you've got to get it 2, 3, 4 times to get the feedback. Why is that? Why aren't they giving you immediate feedback? What's the difference there?
Well, I think it partly has to do with Japanese culture. Employees are not normally, open to speak up, or in company meetings often, who speaks? Only the most senior guy in the room. So you have to kind of nudge them to raise their voice or to participate. But if you do that, they participate. It's like in a meeting or a seminar. If you just ask, are there any questions? You don't get any feedback.
No questions, yeah.
If you ask twice or 3 times, or then ask, well, Nakamura-san, nice to see you here today. I'm sure you have a view about this topic. Then you get the feedback. Yeah? So this is all about engagement. Yeah? And, well, as I said, Japanese are very, in a sense, conservative and well-mannered and well-educated vis-a-vis their seniors. And this respect for the other side and the respect for the other person can sometimes be like a corset. And you have to somehow see how you can break off or take off the corset to engage with the people. I often say to Japanese entrepreneurs, well, in Japan, companies often look to what Okami is saying, what the government is saying. And if you look to Germany, for instance, German, especially small and medium companies or family-owned companies, they don't look to the government. They just look to their business and to the customer and focus on how whether it be in Germany or outside of Germany, how can we develop the business. And there are such people, a lot of such people in Japan also. But there are, again, people who look at what government, Métis or others are doing or saying, what roadmaps are they showing. That's not a mistake to have a roadmap, but you should never lose your own initiative and your own drive and follow your own targets.
What about trust? What's your experience in gaining trust? You've come in as the head, to an existing organisation, or you've come in to become the head. So you've got to get trust anywhere. But what have you found special that works well for getting trust in Japan?
I think trust is a key word for doing business in Japan. And if you're working in a team, and especially if you have a leading role, this is absolutely paramount, to have the trust of your staff. And this may at sometimes mean that you have to take the blame. And you should stand behind your employees and support them. But you also have to gain the trust by showing that things work, that performance results can be delivered. And then people will join you and will come with you. That's my feeling. But trust, gaining trust and building trust is also extremely important with working with customers. Especially, if you're approaching a customer, you haven't had any business with them previously, or a startup or so. Our philosophy, or my philosophy, is first of all, try to understand who they are, what are they about, what are they planning to do, and then go back and say, okay, this is who we are, this is what we propose, what we can do for you to create your success story. I think this is always important to deliver the message that we help to create the success story of our customer. And even if the customer doesn't do business with us in the end, but if he goes away with a good impression, that's always a win for us.
And so, if we think about building a culture in organisation, what have you found works well for building a culture?
Well, I think communicating openly with your teammates and showing roads which we go down together, or which we take together, and also showing empathy. I think that's also important. Yeah? And those are, I think, important points. Of course, there are always, for a foreign manager or expat manager in Japan, one of the biggest challenges is, of course, managing the relationship between the head office and the local organization here in Japan. And in that way, if you are able to manage that properly, you also gain the trust of your employees and colleagues. Yeah.
And if we're going to give some advice, someone's been told, okay, you've got to go to Japan, you've got to run the operation in Japan. If you think of some advice to someone who doesn't know Japan, doesn't speak Japanese, they're going to come here, what would be some advice you'd give them?
Well, I would say have a good look at Japan, see who are the key opinion leaders in your area, try to identify a number of people with whom you can exchange, study your market, see who are your potential partners, competitors, and also important stakeholders. And then don't be afraid of entering the Japanese market, and don't come here with a mindset, Japan is a difficult market. I think Japan is an open market, and there are many opportunities here. People have a lot of preconceptions about Japan, and leave those preconceptions about Japan at home. Come here, meet people, engage them, and you will find your way.
Should they learn Japanese?
Actually, I've heard very different opinions about this from people who have been very successful in Japan, managers who have said, no, I've worked in Japan successfully without speaking more than 3 words of Japanese. And on the other hand, you have now many young, talented people who speak excellent Japanese and who are going about their job successfully. Sometimes it's an advantage not to show that you speak Japanese very well.
Yep.
Sometimes it's an advantage to speak a little bit broken Japanese.
Yep.
You don't want to give your Japanese counterpart the impression that you are kind of superior in any way. But to be honest, I think having studied Japanese or having studied about Japanese history and Japanese economy is a huge advantage in doing business in Japan. I remember taking courses on Japanese economic history and looking at the different zaibatsu, the financial cliques we had in pre-war Japan, and what became of all these companies after the war. That was actually very helpful for me to understand the different relationships between companies after the war and during my years, not only in banking, but even later.
So what would be your definition of leadership, George?
Well, for me, leadership is, first of all, to stand up and raise your voice, to stand in front of your team and engage your team, and to show the path which we take together, and also to encourage people to think as entrepreneurs. We are not normally born as entrepreneurs, but we should think as entrepreneurs and be willing to take risks to achieve what we want to achieve. And also consider the values you have, your own values, the corporate values, societal values. I think that's also very important, all the more in these days where we have huge challenges like climate change or aging demographies and other challenges.
All right. Well, George, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been terrific to hear your experiences and your insights, and it's been very valuable. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg Sensei.
Well, there we go. Please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.